to share my. Do you see my screen?
Yep, we see your screen.
Full screen?
We see your presenter view.
All right. Okay. This is better?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining today. And this is a tutorial on transfer learning and online tuning with PROTEAS-TUNE ytopt. It's an auto tuning software that we have been developing. I'm Prasanna Balaprakash, computer scientist at Argonne National Lab, part of the project. And along with me today, Breeze Viju. He will be presenting our tutorial. That's the second part. Let's. Okay, let me take the laser pointer. Yeah, Breeze will be presenting the second part. It's a tutorial, hands-on tutorial with Jupyter notebooks. And Xingfu will be helping helping Breeze during the tutorial. And this is a joint work with many from the PROTEAS-TUNE project, including Jaehoon Koo, Michael Cruz, Jonas, and Paul Hovland, all from Argonne, and also from Mary Hall, University of Utah. So the structure of the tutorial is the following. So first we will present a high-level overview of the ytopt software, and that is something that we will try to sort of cover in first 30 minutes, and then the next 30 to 40 minutes will be spent on the hands-on tutorial using Jupyter notebooks, and you can download the code and try it on your machine as well. So the last 20-30 minutes we will be online, but we will be sort of helping you to run those tutorials. So that's a sort of three-part that we planned. Okay, straight into the tutorial problem. So auto tuning, so we formulate the auto tuning approach from a more mathematical optimization perspective. So finding the best configuration of an auto tuning problem, we see that as an optimization problem where we say, okay, minimize the x. The x is the parameter configuration that we want to find, and f of x is an objective function. That objective function is often a black box, right? So we can generate different input parameter values, and we are looking at runtime. So f of x could be empirical performance metrics such as runtime, flops, energy, or the metric that one want to optimize. The input parameter configuration x, that's a very unique aspect of auto tuning problem. Is there is a it's not all continuous parameters, right? So it's not all real parameters. Often they are not real parameters. In fact, often we are dealing with integer parameters, which we explicitly partition that as xi, or binary parameters xb, and categorical parameters. Binary parameters are true or false, 0 or 1, right? And you can also take categorical parameters. Let's say you have an algorithm type A, B, and C, which doesn't have any type of ordering, and you want to find the best algorithm along with their parameters, then that will be can be encoded as binary parameters as well, which we explicitly say that as xb. And of course, it doesn't mean that we cannot handle the continuous parameters, because, for example, if we have a solver tolerance and that need to be optimized, then we can also include those type of parameters. So essentially, we say the input parameter space is a mixed integer type, which consists of integer, a binary categorical, and real parameters. So these parameters could be anything. So there is no sort of specific constraint on the parameter type itself. But the only thing is, there are various ways to model these parameters, and there exist bounds on those parameters, right? So for example, if you take unroll, you have a minimum and maximum, and tiling often it's a power of 2, right? So it's a better way to model that is not just listing out as 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, but model them as 2 power of I and optimize over 0, 1, 2, 3, rather than the powers of 2, because there is a structure here and there is not a lot of discontinuous values there. So those are sort of think of that as a bound constraints on the input parameters. And there's also algebraic constraints on the parameters. For example, we can express tiling, register tiling 1, register tiling I and j should be less than 150, right? So these are, we can express that algebraically, and we can also evaluate the constraint violation in a very cheap way. In other words, we don't need to run a particular code to know whether we are violating this constraint. The power consumption, there are some constraints that are expensive, right? So for example, if you say, okay, I have a power consumption that needs to be satisfied, then without any sort of power model, you have to run the code and measure the power to say whether you are violating that constraint or not. But even in this case, we know these are like, we know those constraints, so these are often called known constraints. The third class is a hidden constraints, which is often often happens with respect to transformation errors or compilation errors or runtime errors, right? So when we take the code and we transform the code according to a particular input configuration, the code can be invalid, right? It can just say, the transformation, there is a bug in the transformation. It can simply say that the transformation is not valid, or it just throws an error. Again, in this case, we can capture that. It's sort of relatively cheap. But then let's say the code is transformed very well, but then at the compilation level, it fails, then it becomes expensive. And finally, it also has runtime, which is a lot more expensive, because if you transform the code, you pay the cost, compile the code, you pay the cost, and then finally during runtime, it just fails. Either either out of memory error, or some other type of runtime error that creeps in, and that sort of fails the code. So there are a lot of this hidden errors are something that is again particular and prevalent in auto-tuning HPC codes, because not all valid parameter configurations are not all feasible parameter configurations are valid. And often we can also think of capturing some of them using known constraints, but many times it's not possible. But typically the bound constraints are very common in the sense, like, we know the minimum and maximum, and we can express them, and so on and so forth. So those are all the aspects, different aspects of constraints. So it's a very, very challenging optimization problem. Formulation is one thing, but solving that optimization problem, it belongs to, as I mentioned, mixed integer nonlinear optimization problem without derivatives. So we cannot use any derivative-based optimization. So to that end, within the PROTEAS-TUNE project, we have been developing this software called ytopt. And the workflow of ytopt is shown in this figure. So we start from a code. The code could be a kernel, a library that we want to optimize, or an application that we want to optimize. And we transform that code into a code mold. Its code mold is nothing but a parameterized code, right? If you are thinking about matrix multiplication, how can we parameterize that matrix multiplication, like unroll, jam, and blocking, and so on and so forth, right? So we need a code that can be sort of given some parameters. A code transformer can take that code, apply those parameters, and transform that code. So so that's we call code mold. And that is given as an input to the ytopt autotuner along with the parameter space. So the parameter space is the one that I just discussed, where we say, what are all the input parameters? In this case, if you're talking about matrix multiplication, unroll, and unroll can go from 1 to, let's say, 30 for I, j, and k. So that's a parameter space that defines what are all the possible parameters, and how to, what are all the ranges of those parameters. And then once we give these two, then autotuner will take control from that point. It generates different code configurations, and for each of the code configuration, it compiles the code, executes the code, and compute the metric. So this metric is often, let's say, a runtime or some other performance metric, and give that back to the autotuner. And the autotuner, again, based on the values that it receives, it generates the next set of configuration and performs a compilation, execution, and a metric evaluation, and so on and so forth. So this part is repeated, and it is repeated until user-defined budget such as number of evaluations or wall clock time, and exhaustion of that. So once you reach that, then the autotuner stops. And then, while the autotuning is running, we sort of, record all the performances like input configuration and their corresponding runtime. And then we can just select the best configurations from there, or you can also select top K configurations from there and use that for evaluation. Okay. So how do we do this, right? So the key part is the autotuner, how it searches over this very difficult search space and navigate that search space to find high quality configurations. To that end, we use Bayesian optimization. The key to Bayesian optimization is something called probabilistic predictive model. That is illustrated in this cartoon. And consider one-dimensional input and one-dimensional output. A probabilistic learning model is one in which you generate some input configurations and look at their output, corresponding output. For example, all the black points here are something that we have the input and the corresponding output. Okay. Once we have that, the model basically takes that and fits those configurations. And the key aspect of the probabilistic learning model is that wherever it has training points, its uncertainty is 0 because it knows the ground truth, right? As soon as it goes a little bit away from the region where it sampled, your uncertainty sort of goes higher. It basically fits multiple models that pass through your training point, and the multiple models are parameterized in a different way, so you get that uncertainty estimate. So essentially, it's like, okay, wherever I have seen the training points, the uncertainty is 0. The farther I go away from those training points, the uncertainty will grow. And this is the key property that the Bayesian optimization will leverage to sample and to navigate this high-dimensional search space. Okay, a classical example for this probabilistic learning model is a Gaussian process regression, which is really good when all your parameters are real, which means continuous parameters. Whereas in autotuning, we often deal with the discrete and integer parameters. So unless and until one comes up with problem-specific customizations for the kernels, it's hard to model these parameters in a straightforward way. The other methods that can provide such a kind of uncertainty estimate are random forest, extra tree regressor, and so on and so forth. So one can use that. And in our experience, we have seen that, like, when your number of parameters, number of categorical and integer parameters increases, then these type of random forest and extra tree regressor methods are a lot more performant compared to Gaussian process, whereas your parameters are either small or your parameter is not sort of creating a lot of discontinuity in the search space. There is not much difference between Gaussian process and random forest. At the end of the day, if the autotuning problem is reasonably, it's not like super hard, doesn't have a lot of categorical parameters, there is no significant difference between Gaussian process and random forest, for example. Okay. The pseudocode for Bayesian optimization is shown here, and the algorithm sort of starts with randomly sampled configurations, and then fitting this probabilistic learning model, and use this probabilistic learning model to sample the next set of configuration, and that's what the pseudocode shows. And the key aspect of the Bayesian optimization is the point number 3. Where how this next point is selected, right? So we take these points, we fit the probabilistic model, and then now, given this probabilistic model with uncertainty, with the predictive, with the prediction and the uncertainty, how can we select the next set of points? And that is the central theme in many different variants of Bayesian optimization. To that end, there are multiple methodologies or multiple acquisition functions, we call them, to allow Bayesian optimization to select the next set of points. For example, upper confidence bound is simply given by the predictive, so given X, so given a number of unseen input parameter configurations, we can use the probabilistic model to predict the mean and also predict the variance, right? So that is a key part of this probabilistic model. So it's not only the mean. Many machine learning models will give mean predictions, but they don't give the standard deviation, the uncertainty. So that's why we had to rely on probabilistic learning models. So here we have mean predictions and the uncertainty. So once we have mu and sigma, the upper confidence bound is basically combine both of them to select the next set of points. Let's say you have generate 10,000 unseen points, okay, and you compute this UCB with its mean prediction and the sigma x, and beta is a user-defined parameter, and then select the best one, the best point that has the minimal or the maximal UCB. UCB is for maximization. The corresponding minimization is LCB, but both are same. Expected improvement, again, similar formula. You can see mu of x, sigma f x, and probability of improvement. So these are various different ways in which, given a probabilistic model, how to select the next point. And these acquisition functions basically try to explore and exploit, which means that if you have a probabilistic model and if you are confident about certain predictions, whether to sample from that region, which is called exploitation, or to go and sample from region where the uncertainty is higher, so that you can reduce the uncertainty such that your probabilistic model will get better as you move forward, as you evaluate more configurations, which eventually results in better configurations as one samples in the further iterations. Okay, so a cartoon demonstration of again, this is UCB/LCB. So this is a lower confidence bound. Let's say we are minimizing the runtime, right? In that case, you use lower confidence bound. Note is a symbol negative. If you are sort of maximizing flops, then you have to use UCB, which is nothing but mu x plus beta of times sigma of x. So the nice thing about this acquisition function is its simplicity. Okay, and what you see here is again the probabilistic model, and the red points are the observations, which means, let's say we sample those configurations and we know the ground truth for those configurations. And mu of x, the blue one, are the model predictions, and this band is the uncertainty. Okay, so given this probabilistic model, okay, you can see that wherever we sampled, we have a smaller uncertainty, right? Whereas these regions where we don't have samples have large uncertainty. Okay, given this probabilistic model, now we can go and evaluate for different inputs the corresponding LCB function values. And evaluating LCB function values is relatively cheap, and it can be done in milliseconds, right? So that's the advantage of using a predictive model. And then the corresponding LCB function, once you compute the LCB function on the same input space, how does that look like is shown in this cartoon. Okay, so once we compute the LCB function, we can find the minimal of that LCB function that is shown in this x, and that is the point that will be selected for the next evaluation. So you can see, like here, let's say minus 0.8 is the one that will be selected next. So that is what's selected next here. Okay, and now once we have this, we put this back in the model and then retrain, and you can see now the uncertainty in this region has decreased. Now we have to go and select the next point. Similarly, we can then compute LCB for different inputs, and the corresponding LCB function is shown here. And from that, we can say, okay, here is a minimal LCB value, so that will be selected next. So we will be looking at something here, right? So this point is selected next, and so on and so forth. So this process is repeated until the convergence. So as you can see, as you move forward, the LCB function value is used again and again to select the next point. Okay. Excuse me. Okay, so the other key feature of ytopt is the scalability, which means that the Bayesian optimization is inherently a sequential process, which means that it's one at a time, right? So you take an evaluation, you sample a point, you evaluate, take that, put that back in the model, retrain, and then select the next configuration. So this is computationally expensive, right? So auto-tuning is computationally expensive if it is like one at a time. But given we have multiple nodes at our disposal, can we parallelize this auto-tuning? And that's where ytopt provides this functionality of scaling. Here, the idea is at the master, so you have a manager worker configuration where you have a manager that runs the search and it generates multiple configurations to be samples, and each of that configuration is sort of sent to a different worker. So workers being like different nodes. Let's say we have 10 different nodes for auto tuning, right? There is a manager node that generates 10 different configurations, and each configuration is evaluated at a worker node, and it just sends the results back. There is a runtime back to the manager. The manager takes the results and then retrain the model and send a new configuration as soon as some of them finishes. Right? So it's not batch synchronous; it's completely asynchronous. Wherein as soon as one of the worker finishes its evaluation, the results is sent back, and you can generate a new configuration immediately to fill that worker. And the key advantage here is that for the same wall clock time, you can perform a lot more evaluations, and you can significantly reduce the time to solution, time to find high quality configurations. So we cannot just sample a lot of configurations using the LCB. So we have to do some extra work to do this multi-point evaluation. To that end, we adopt Kriging Believer. Also, this is also called concept layer scheme. Okay, so the initialization phase is the same, where you start with the optimizer that generates, let's say, if you have k workers, k different configurations and send them, right? And now some of them finishes, let's say all k finishes, and now you want to generate the next k set of configurations, right? If you just naively sample all of them, then that results in waste of computational time, because there is a possibility that all these configurations come from the same region of the search space, and you want to avoid that. So to avoid that and to sort of diversify the sampling of the configurations, the concept layer or the Kriging Believer scheme perform the following. So given a model M and the acquisition function U, to generate k configurations, the following steps are repeated k times. So first we select a point X that maximizes U with respect to M, right? So that's with the respect to the acquisition function. The first configuration is usual, business as usual, using the acquisition function, right? And then to select the next point, we take the mean, the predictive mean of that configuration, and then lie to the model that its prediction is right? So once you do that, then the uncertainty of the previously sampled configuration that is sent for evaluation becomes 0. Once it becomes 0, then the next point that is selected will not be near to the point that was already selected. And because of that, we can sort of diversify this and generate and look at multiple regions of various uncertainties. So this process is repeated k times. Each time, to generate a configuration, take the previous configuration's predicted value, lie to the model, refit the model, make the uncertainty 0, and then select the next one. The other thing to note that is often in Bayesian optimization, an optimizer is used to select the point, but instead of that, we use sampling because of the mixed integer space, and do performing any sort of mixed integer optimization here will slow down the entire search. So instead of relying on sophisticated optimizer, we just do random sampling, a lot of randomly sampled configurations, and then because evaluating those configurations with the model is very straightforward and computationally less expensive, so we use that sort of trick to speed up the search. And with respect to model, as I said previously, instead of Gaussian process, we use an ensemble of regression trees, which can handle the categorical and integer parameters in a very straightforward way. And also it provides a lot of scalability, because this is building number of trees, let's say hundreds of trees, and all those 100 trees can be fit in parallel using multiple cores, and a lot of new libraries coming from NVIDIA and Intel can be leveraged to speed up this tree construction. So Gaussian process has problems with respect to the scalability, and whereas the regression trees can provide really good scalability for model fitting. And note that we have to do this model fitting for each of this point when we want to generate. So this parallelization is key, and it should be fast enough. And that's, regression trees are really good for that. And of course, this regression trees are often robust and doesn't require a lot of parameter tuning. Okay, so now we have covered how to do a single auto tuning, which means that, okay, here is a code mold, and we define an input size and we generate a configuration, right? High performing configuration for that particular input size. This is fine if you are doing offline tuning, right? So we have specific input size, we have particular kernel, particular application or library, and you want to do it offline, fine, and then we can tune that because we can afford that many evaluations. Often we have to run, let's say, hundreds of different code configurations within the search to generate high quality configurations. Online tuning is different. Online tuning is a case where you say, okay, I want to do code tuning, or I want to generate different variants of a library or a kernel in an online fashion, high performing one in an online fashion. And that's not an easy problem, right? Because we cannot just take the offline tuning and apply it to online, because offline we have exploration, exploitation. We can afford a lot of bad configurations to learn how bad they are, so that we can avoid evaluating them, and so on and so forth. So offline, although expensive, there is a lot of flexibility. And online, we don't have that sort of flexibility. For example, in the kernel, online auto tuning, you say, okay, I want to tune matrix multiplication in an online fashion, right? How can you do that possibly? Because if the application is using that kernel, you cannot afford any sort of slowdown in that particular kernel execution. So you need to be fast, you need to be efficient, and so on and so forth. So we cannot just take the offline tuning and apply it to online tuning and be done with it. So that's why with the ytopt, we have been developing modules for online tuning, and that is the focus of the tutorial. In particular, we will be focusing in this tutorial on how to do online tuning for different input sizes. This is relevant for many different cases. For example, if you take JIT auto tuning, just-in-time compilation and just-in-time auto tuning, online tuning is very relevant and very important. And application auto tuning, where you say, okay, I can afford to do auto tuning for smaller input sizes of an application, but my real production runs are large input sizes. So I want to sort of take whatever I learned from smaller input size and apply it to large input size, or leverage that knowledge. Yeah, so the challenges are something that I just mentioned. First of all, we cannot use offline methods because computation is expensive. We cannot afford exploration, a lot of exploration in the search space, because that will slow down the actual production code in an online setting. And an important constraint here is we want to generate high quality parameter configurations rapidly. We cannot afford to do like exploration, exploitation, and find the best configurations, but from a get-go. So here is an input size, and I want to generate high quality configuration in one shot, which means that I have a budget of only one evaluation, and I want to generate high quality configuration for that, for one evaluation, within one evaluation, or within 5 evaluations. So it's a very budget constrained tuning that presents a lot of challenges. So the approach that we came up for online tuning is a two-phase approach, right? Where in the offline phase, we do the same sort of offline auto tuning that we described so far, but for different input sizes. So we say we define a set of training input size, so-called training input size, NT1 to NTN, and for each of the input size, and for the particular kernel or library or application, we run the auto tuning. Okay, and then for each of that input size, we have all the sort of configurations, the results. Once we have the results, we build a sort of a meta model across input sizes, right? So across input sizes, those results, we build a meta model and take that meta model online. Now, in the online phase, whatever the input size. So think of these input sizes are the unseen input sizes. These are different from these input sizes, because if you are looking at input sizes from the offline, you can just look up the best configuration and be done with it. And we are talking about unseen input sizes, and those input sizes, as soon as you give an input size, we want to generate a high quality configuration immediately, right? So that's the sort of the two-phase approach in which we do the offline tuning, generate a meta model across input sizes, and then take that model online and use that to suggest to get the best configuration for the unseen input sizes. There are many different ways to approach to build that meta model. The one that we experimented so far is called Gaussian cupola. Essentially, Gaussian cupola is an approach for capturing dependency between random variables. And at a high level, what we are trying to do is consider the auto-tuning results for each input size as a distribution. And then what we are trying to do is to build or to couple these distributions using a Gaussian cupola model. So here the meta model is a Gaussian cupola model. So think of the auto-tuning results for each input size as a random variable from a model by a random distribution. And we are trying to sort of couple them using a Gaussian cupola model that is represented by a multivariate normal distribution with the covariance and covariance zeta and mean 0 and so on and so forth. So essentially, we are using a multivariate normal distribution to build that meta model, to combine the auto-tuning results from each of that input size. How does that look like during the training? We as I said, we define a set of training input sizes, run auto-tuning for each input size, collect the results, and define a threshold for high-performing configurations, right? So recall that each, offline, we do both exploration and exploitation. Doesn't mean that all the configurations seen by the search are high-performing. So we sort of set a threshold to define what are all the high-performing configurations. And once we get those high-performing configurations, we consider that as a distribution for that particular input size. And then we train a Gaussian cupola model across different input sizes, and then take that Gaussian cupola model and integrate that in an online fashion or for transfer learning or whatsoever. So how does that look like? So this is a parallel coordinate plot for different input sizes, right? So think of this, the first plot is the first coordinate is an input size, and these are all the different parameters. So essentially the high performing, each color represents one input size, okay? And the Gaussian cupola model is trying to capture these correlations between high performing configurations across input size. And that is the key. So once we capture the correlations across input size, now given a new input size that we haven't seen, we can use this model to predict what is a high performing configuration for parameter P0, P1, P3. And we can also predict what is its performance, provided if we fit the model with respect to performance as well. So this is the sort of a key idea. Capture the joint probability distribution of high performing configurations across auto tuning runs over different input sizes, so that we can predict from get-go a new high performing configuration for an unseen input size. Okay, so I'm almost at the end. To summarize, so we have developed this model-based search for auto tuning within PROTEAS-TUNE project, and the software is called ytopt. It uses a random forest. It's in particular, this type of models are well suited if the search space is highly search space is characterized by integer and categorical parameters. It uses Bayesian optimization for exploration and exploitation. In particular, it provides parallelization schemes using Kriging Believer and multi-point evaluation schemes. And with respect to the online tuning, we use currently a Gaussian cupola model. The reason being it's computationally cheap to train. To train on multiple input sizes, it takes less than few seconds to fit this meta model. And once we fit that meta model, it's sort of it is available as a Python object, and you can sort of make it callable within your application. then use it for sampling in an online fashion. We are also exploring other non-parametric models. Please keep an eye on the repo. We are currently looking at various other models instead of Gaussian coupler to model to come up with these online models that are a lot more efficient and so on and so forth. But so far for the input sizes, Gaussian coupler meta model works very well, but we are also sort of expanding this to other type of settings, and in particular like the transfer learning setting, where we go from smaller input size of an application to large input size, and how to transfer the auto-tuning results from one to the other, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of interesting developments happening on that front, and we'll be integrating those new features in the coming days. Acknowledgements to the ECP PROTEAS-TUNE project, and some references, and the link to the software. That I end my talk, and we are open for some questions before entering into the tutorial, hands-on tutorial.
Sana, I have one question about slide 8. Answer, simple answer. If you want to add more, you can add.
Oh, okay. So let me share the screen.
In the chat.
Yeah. Okay. If I share the screen, I cannot. Okay, wait. Let me share this. Okay. Slide number 8. Is that correct?
Yeah, regarding is LCB.
Yeah. Slide number 8 or 9. Yeah, this one. Okay. Let me go and read the question. Is the assumption that all data points are already collected and the LCB function will help in reducing which samples are evaluated? No, all the points are not collected at this point. So the X here is on unseen points. So, think of this as, all the points where we collected the data is all on the red, right? And all other points, you can go and randomly sample from the input space. And those are the unseen points. The LCB sees only the unseen points. If you send a seen point to an LCB, the model prediction will be perfect and the sigma X will be 0. So it's sort of, LCB is about selecting the points that you haven't seen seen so far. So, often the X is randomly sampled from the input space, and often it's like a large number of points. For example, in ytopt we set this number to 10K. So we select 10,000 randomly sampled points from the input space, send it to the LCB, and then compute the LCB function and select the minimal one. Does it answer the question, Tansima?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Right.
So I have a question. If you instead, is it possible to assume that taking an observation does not reduce the variance to 0 at a given point?
It could be. For example, if your runs are highly noisy, right? So that is the nice thing about Bayesian optimization. The framework itself incorporates the noisy observation. So, for example, let's say your runtime is it's not reproducible in the sense that there is a lot of variance from run to run. You don't, so typical way that people deal with it is like, okay, run 5 times, take an average and give that, right? You don't have to do that in Bayesian optimization. You can let the algorithm to sort of decide what to do with that variance. Sometimes, you evaluate the configuration and you say, okay, I'm seeing interesting configurations here, but I need to evaluate more, and that's the thing that this LCB can LCB along with the sigma fx, the variance, the non-zero variance can provide, right? So you evaluated a configuration, but you for each time, let's say 3 or 4 times, same input but different values. That means that there is a variance associated with it. So essentially, the probabilistic learning model models that variance itself, and the algorithm can decide what to do with that. Does it answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So simple answer is yes. Even if you give that point, and if it is a non-deterministic response, then the variance can be non-zero. Okay, if there are no more questions, then we can go to the tutorial, the hands-on tutorial part of the session. And Breeze, do you want to take it?
Yep. Thank you, Prasanna. Let me try sharing. Takes a few seconds to pop up. You should see something now. Can you?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to present you the tutorial in a notebook form, but there's also a command line version of the tutorial that is presented on the ytopt repository. So here is the link. For now, it's in the online MMM blog branch, but it will be merged soon once we are satisfied that we fixed all the little inconsistencies that could have crept in. So I put in the chat the link to the file, which is the entry point into the tutorials. And I will be first explaining a bit how I set up my environment in order to do the tutorial. Let me try to activate my camera as well. Here, you should see my ugly baby. So, what is the environment I've been using here? So I've been using the exact environment that is described on the page that I linked. So I created a Conda environment to a self-contained environment that doesn't spill outside of it. So I called it ytopt. And then I created I downloaded all the required softwares inside a ytopt directory. So what we installed is a couple of GitHub repositories with specific versions of forks that are in our own repositories, plus config space, because they didn't make a release since our last pull request has been accepted. So the idea is that you do an install using pip inside this Conda environment of these 4 softwares. You shouldn't have to be doing this step here. It's only if you have trouble installing it. And then, as we are doing notebooks, you have to install IPython and Jupyter as well. We'll not be talking about CCS, cconfig space today, so you can skip this particular step. But we are talking about online tuning today. So when you install ytopt, be sure to install it using the online option. Else, the second part of the tutorial will not be working because we will be lacking SDV dependency, so the synthetic data vault. So once you do the install steps, you have the entries for the different tutorials. And the two tutorials I'm going to use today is the first one, which is a block matrix multiplication tutorial, which presents offline tuning to optimize a block matrix blocking kernel. And the second tutorial we'll be looking at today is the auto-tuning block matrix multiplication online, where we'll be doing exactly what Prasanna presented into the talk, meaning that we will use offline tuning on small matrix size and try to guess the best configurations on a bigger problem, which would be much more cost prohibitive, and do that in an online manner inside of the tutorial. So let's get started. So what I did to run the notebooks is exactly what I just told you. Follow the installation tutorial, and then once you're in your environment, you just run the Jupyter Notebook command. For instance, I ran it into the samples directory, and I went and opened the notebooks which are in these two folders in the notebook subfolder, where you have the two notebooks we are going to use today. So the standard one and the transfer learning version of the tutorial. So let's dive in the tutorial here. So as Prasanna mentioned, we have many components inside of ytopt, and some of these components we expect the user to provide to give you maximum flexibility. So those components can be on different languages. So rather than have a usual standard notebook where we only have Python code that is run into the notebook, here I did something a bit different, where I am writing the files that the notebook will be using and using shell commands to run those files. And I will be presenting those different components we'll be using, but in the end, you have a folder where you can run the commands directly, and more or less you get the same results that with the command line version of the tutorial. So the first script that is presented here is a rather simple one. It's your evaluator. So imagine you have compiled your kernel into an executable form. This function does exactly what Prasanna was presenting earlier. It's taking the average of 5 execution of the executable. You could very well be using a different script that takes a different evaluation. For instance, you could take the minimum of your evaluation if you think the noise is not relevant to you, or the mean is not the objective you're trying to attain. So you could have different versions. So this one is a Perl script. And if I run this block, what I do is I just rewrote the file exe.pl, which is the wrapper around our command. You need to make this one executable. So I just turn it into an executable file. The second version is the code mode Prasanna was talking about. So this one is a correct blocked version of a DGEM, where the block size is given as a preprocessor define during compilation. And the matrix size is fixed in this case to 100. In the online transfer learning version of the tutorial, we'll use the same kernel, but in this case, the matrix size will be also given as an argument through preprocessor define to the code mode. So here, I won't go into the details, but you can run this matrix and you have a checked version that you can run to assert that the results are correct. So blocking a matrix is a bit complicated because you have to, if you want the results to be exact, you have to take into account the remainders if the block size does not evenly split your matrix size. So I won't go into the details of the code mode, but I made sure to test it so that it is accurate. So this is an example of a simple code mode, and it just executes the matrix multiplication that the first script will be running. So let's write this into our CPP file here, which is mmblock.cpp. And then the next script we will be needing is our evaluator function, really, more or less, which is a wrapper that is going to compile our code mode with a specific configuration we will be using, and then leverage the script we defined earlier to execute it and gather the results. And in the end, return it or raise an exception, or at least transfer to ytopt the fact that the run failed. So runs are not really supposed to fail in this example, as we have checked the different values. So the example should not fail, and at least it never failed in my experience. So we put this in a plopper.py file. And of course, if there are questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the questions right away, and we'll be glad to answer.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add the part is here. Basically, like mmblock.cpp, that's the from original code, the parameters only is the block size. Right? Then when you compare this new generated code, generate like a executable called temp binary. That's pass this executable to the EXEPL to do the execution. Yeah, that's good.
Exactly. Thank you, Xingfu, for those precisions. So now we are getting into the more ytopt part of the tutorial. So here we are going to define the configuration space to explore. So this is our problem definition. So all of those components are more or less independent. The previous component are independent from ytopt. This one is very deeply involved into ytopt because it will be creating a ytopt problem for ytopt to solve. But it's a definition by itself. The file is not an executable. It defines the problem, and you cannot really run the file without ytopt as a driver. So what we do here is that we will be creating a configuration space. Here we fixed the seed, but it's not very important. And Prasanna was discussing the different kind of hyperparameters during this talk. In this case here, we use an integer hyperparameter, which is uniform, meaning that we will be sampling all the values between 1 and 10. The default between the middle ground is 5 here. And this is the only parameter we have, the block size, that we'll be studying in this offline example. We have an output space, which is the time it takes to execute our kernel. So it's in the real value space between 0 and infinity if we didn't manage to evaluate the point, which would mean we have an error. Then the script would return infinity. So what we are doing is we are initializing the plopper class we defined in the previous script to point toward the C++ file we are going to be compiling in order to get the executable that we want to evaluate. And here we create an objective function, meaning a function that will return the results of the evaluation of a configuration. So we give it a point in the input space, and it should give us back the time it took, in our case, to evaluate to evaluate our code mode, which is instantiated with a specific block size. So I just wrote this file onto the disk here, and you see the problem that is defined is a ytopt tuning problem. So with an input space and an output space, meaning the configuration space here and the time it takes, and the objective function. And with these three objects, we are defining our ytopt tuning problem, which means that now we can run our search using the workflow evaluate array. The problem is what we just defined here. So it's in the problem file, and it's called problem. We only want to evaluate 5 configurations in this case. We don't want it to be too long. And we'll be using random forest to decide which points we want to search and to build our surrogate model. So it takes a bit of time to run as we are repeating the configuration, and I'm also internally repeating the matrix multiplication inside of the C++ file. So here we are done, and we evaluated those different configurations with block size of 2, 8, 6, 7, and 1. And we can see that not blocking is quite a drastic effect on performance. And from our evaluations, 8 is the best version, which is more than twice as fast as a block size of 1. So this is more or less the offline version of the tutorial. And then we are going to leverage this offline workflow for the online part of the tutorial. Are there any questions on the first notebook? Okay. I'll take that as a no and switch directly to the second one. Don't hesitate to ask questions in writing as well. And Xingfu will interrupt me and we can discuss the questions. So each of the notebook is self-contained. So as you can see, we are in the second notebook also redefining our Perl scripts, but it should be mostly unchanged from the previous one. We are using the same parameterized code, but in this case, I'm using the matrix size as an argument, as a parameter through the preprocessor. So we can change it. But aside from that, the script, the C++ or the C file isn't changed as well. Our plugger evaluator is slightly different this time because it now takes 2 arguments, 2 parameters, which is the block size and the matrix size, which are now input parameters for our plugger find runtime function. So we can write it as well. And the search space, the problem here is only slightly modified in the sense that I get the matrix size from the environment, which was one of the quickest way to modify the script originally. And here, in our objective function, we pass the matrix size parameter as a second parameter to our find runtime function. So in the values, we add the matrix size that we've been given in the environment, And the parameter names is called matrix size, as we've seen earlier. So for now, there is only 3 or 4 modifications to the first tutorial, and will be now evaluated in the different matrix sizes.
So Grace, yeah,
Yes.
I think can you go back a little bit? I think, yeah, I think the search space also different, right? You will use 100.
Yes, here indeed. So Jae-hoon wrote all those tutorials, so I want to to give back to
because
Jae-hoon what it is.
The matrix size is just input size. The search space is block size. That's the from 1 to 100.
Jae-hoon wanted
100 different configuration.
Yeah, exactly. Jae-hoon wanted to showcase that given we are exploring bigger matrix sizes, we would be interested in evaluating more block sizes here. So if you see here, he's also using more evaluations, so 30. That's why it will take a bit more time to run. So he's using 30 evaluations to explore more of the space here. And of course, 30 evaluations would not have made any sense if we were only limited to 10 values. So here are all the values that we have tested for the first matrix size. So as you can see in the script, the seed is fixed. So the first values we will be testing for the different matrices will be the same, because these are the initial value, our random forest learning process here. But we will be applying these to, so we already have the results for the 100 size, and we put those results into their own CSV file here. And now we are doing the same thing for the 200 matrix size, and we will be saving those results into their own CSV file as well. So we also set some other parameters here that I don't not feel confident talking about. So if you have questions about those, don't hesitate, because Prasanna would be able to tell you more.
Maximum value, that's the maximum number of evaluation, like 30. There's a learners from them random forest. Then the evaluators, that's use 3 and others, I think.
Yeah, so and kappa set to 1.96 is the beta value that was part of the LCB. So it sort of provides a trade-off between exploration and exploitation. And acquisition function GPH is also means that we don't use a single acquisition function, but we use multiple acquisition functions, starting from LCB, probability of improvement and expected improvement, all of them in an alternative way.
Yeah, and thank you, Prasanna. And I think it's very important that indeed, the bigger the kappa, the more biased toward exploration you are, because you are increasing the impact of the variance on your evaluation function. So you're increasing the noise weight rather than the mean, if I'm correct, right?
Yes, correct. So if beta value is set to, let's say, a large, or in the kappa value set to a very large value, then the configurations are sort of biased to minimize the variance, which means that wherever the model is uncertain, you will go and sample this. Search will sample more configurations from those regions. Whereas if your beta is set to, or beta / kappa is set to 0, then the standard deviation or the variance is not taken into account. The model becomes more greedy or more exploitive. It just goes and relies only on the mean and try to select configurations that improves the mean. And theoretically, it is like set to 1.96 to trade off between exploration and exploitation.
Right. Mhm.
So here we have our results for the 200 matrix size that arrived. So here our algorithm is a cubic one. So we've doubled the matrix size. So we should see an 8-time increase in the matrix multiplication time, and more or less that's the results we are getting. So 4.8 to 38, and if you multiply 8 by 4.8, you should be getting more or less 48 here. So the algorithm complexity is indeed respected here. And we are, in the meantime, evaluating the 300 matrix size. But while we're doing this, I can start going over the transfer learning script. So this script will be split into different cells. So if you happen to use the notebooks and you modify the scripts, you need to rerun all the cells to regenerate the full file. Else, if you use the later cells, you will just be appending the same code again inside the file, and you will end up with an invalid file. So the first cell overrides the file, and the other cells append to the file. So it's a bit strange workflow for notebooks, so I just wanted to make sure I mentioned it here. So the idea here is that ytopt is now an application. This Python script is now an application that will be leveraging our previous experiments to create a Gaussian coupler model. And we will use this model to suggest configurations to try by setting the matrix size to some size we have not seen before. And in this case, we'll be using a matrix size of 500, which is almost twice as big as the biggest size we would have been evaluating here. And the evaluation would be 8 times as expensive. So they are starting to become prohibitive here. So we have here several parameters to our script. So the maximum number of here our 300 size is finished. So the maximum number of evaluations we will be doing during this process. And refit is a parameter which says every X evaluations, please refit the Gaussian coupler model using our new values in order to refine the model with what we have learned during the online process. Because it doesn't mean that the model has to be fixed. The model can still evolve and we can still learn from the experiments. It just means that we are supposed to start at better place in space so that we don't pay very bad configuration at the beginning. The top, the seed is pretty self-explanatory, but the top parameter here says what is a fraction of the configuration if I sort the previous configurations as obtained by their performance. What is a fraction that I want to use to create my Gaussian coupler model? So by default, we take only the 10% best configurations. But in the experiments I'll be showing, we will be taking the 30% best configuration here. Here is the target size. So by default, we put 400, but we will be using 500 in this example. So we extract those parameters and they are used here during the script. So I will override the first part of the script. So I've started overwriting my runOnline.tl.py file. And now we are defining our objective function, which is pretty similar to what we've been doing previously, meaning we use our plotter here. But we just define our objective function to have two parameters now, the block size and the matrix size as well. So we are kind of rewriting part of the script that is on top, but in order to evaluate for the target matrix size right now. Here is where it becomes very interesting and very new. Here we are building our Gaussian copula model. So what we do is we take the different sizes we evaluated beforehand. So I must not forget to run my different cells. We are using the data from the 100 matrix size evaluation, 200 and 300. We're opening the CSV files, taking the 30%, in our case, evaluations, best evaluation in each of these. And then we are appending them to a data frame that is used to build our Gaussian copula here. And we also define our inputs, limits, and of course, the block size we want to evaluate here. So now that we have this model, this Gaussian copula model available, we can do the transfer learning part. So what we're doing is that we are writing our results and running the kernel inside of the Python loop here. So what we do, and the interesting part starts here, is that more or less we are sampling 1,000 times the Gaussian copula model to give us points. And those points come not only with a configuration to test, but also with an inference of the possible performance at these configurations. What we do is, of course, we have to cast it on the integer space, and we remove the duplicate configurations here. But what we do here is then we sort those values by the runtime that is evaluated by our Gaussian copula model. And we start evaluating the best of those configuration. And then we get our performance results, and we iterate if we want to refit the model, to refine the model while we are evaluating, but supposedly much better configuration than if we had started from scratch. So here, our run online tl.py file is complete, and we can run our experiments. So the first experiment is we are going to run 10 times the kernels for a matrix size of 500, and we don't want to do any refit, so we put the refit at every 10 evaluation. And as I told you before, we'll be keeping the top 30% of the 100, 200, and 300 test data that we gathered previously. Well, this will take a bit of time because we're still evaluating 10 matrix multiplication. And of course, we are an order of magnitude bigger once again. So we should be seeing evaluation time of way more than a second here. And then we will be printing those, and I will be afterwards rerunning the experiments with a refit of 5, and we'll see if we are exploring different part of the space. And once again, the seed is set by default and we are not changing it. So the exploration should be the same at first, and then it should change due to the fact that we are refitting the model, and we will be most probably targeting a different area of the space, because most probably the model, even if it is a good predictor of the performance, may not be a direct transfer between 100, 200, and 300, and then 500, because as the matrix grows bigger, different memory effects can take place. So the model may not be, is most probably not exact, not a perfect predictor here.
Yeah, here I think for the top is 0.3, like then 30% best performed configuration from each problem size. Use this as training data sets to build a model. For this one, we just use model to predict the best configuration. So this one, use that predict the best configuration to evaluate that value. We didn't sample in the parameter space.
Exactly. So it should be almost done for this one. Of course, if there are questions in the meantime, we'll be glad to take them. Will tell me where it's done. I wanted to mention something. Yes, I wanted to mention that on my computer, and it depends on the architecture and your compiler. The results from the performance point of view are quite stable, and the amplitude of performance variation are quite limited on my machine. So 1 being usually the worst one, and you see we have a factor of 2 between here and there. But the performance difference in this particular kernel on this particular machine is not very extreme. So the predictor is focusing on a very limited area due to this. So here we have the results of the first one. You can display it a bit more nicely by reading the CSV and plotting it, outputting it here. But here the configuration that we tried, that the model told us would be quite good. And you see that the variations in this case are very, very small compared to what we've seen previously. So the model really focused on area of the space that are promising here. So I'll rerun right away the next one, but I'm not sure we will have finished by the end of the tutorial. But more or less, the first 5 numbers, the first 5 configuration tested will be the same because the seed used is the same, and we are not yet in an exploration phase. But afterwards, we will be sampling different part of the space, most probably. So we are almost done here. Are there any questions regarding the notebooks or the tutorial or the talks now that we have put the talk into perspective? Feel free to ask.
I just quickly add one comment here. For the list here, the one is the block size, one is the execution time, and the last one is the explosive elapsed time. That's the means from beginning to do auto-tuning until finish one. So you can see what's the overhead for the auto-tuning, what's the execution time for program itself.
Yeah, especially since you need to multiply this by 5, because you're averaging 5 executions and taking the average. So we spend 5 times as long benchmarking the kernel, and if you look, it more or less corresponds to the time we spent here.
Yes.
So the overhead of ytopt by itself, in this case, has been pretty negligible.
Yeah, around 3 seconds for the other overhead. Yeah.
Or around 1 second, really, because it's 4.4. So.
Oh, 4.4. Yeah, right.
So it's 22 or something. So yeah, more or less, we are. The process by itself is really negligible, and the fact that illustrates what Prasanna was telling earlier, that when we sampled here 1,000 Gaussian copula configurations with the predicted runtime, it is really way cheaper than evaluating one of those configurations, which is what we're doing in the loop.
Right.
So we know that it takes more or less 200 seconds, which is roughly 5 minutes to run the second command. So we should be having the results by the end of the session.
Yeah, because each evaluation you run 5 times. That's the big problem.
Yeah, 20 seconds for each evaluation.
Yeah.
I could have reduced. I could have reduced the number of repetition up there to 3 here, and it would have been almost twice as fast.
And I think simple you change the number you evaluate for each one. That's 5 to 1, 2, and maybe fast.
Here we are.
Okay, great.
And we gain 4 seconds on the whole process. So maybe it's because we explored better part of the space, or maybe it's just because we were lucky. I guess we'll never know. But we started gaining time once we refit the model. We would need more.
But even the refitting, Brice, you know, there is no exploration, because in the online setting we are not going to explore much.
Right.
This is primarily like you take the results and use the refit, but even still, then you still exploit. That's why you see, you know, the runtimes are pretty close, are trying to be.
Yeah, but nonetheless, the ranking of the candidates have changed.
And oh, so, yeah, because you are refitting. Exactly.
Yeah.
So potentially you've explored first.
Yeah.
You've used first the ones which were more promising, and maybe your evaluation is a bit better, so you're selecting better ones.
Yeah.
That's my nice story, you know. We would need, of course, to repeat this on a larger scale to be certain. And the fact that we are refusing to repeat the configuration makes it that even if we found one of the best configuration at the very beginning, here, this one is the best one we've tried yet. At some point, we would stop trying new configuration and just keep proposing the best one we found. Because if we are obviously not finding better points, it doesn't make sense to continue exploiting the model, whereas we have found a good candidate for the run.
But sometimes you want to avoid the local optimal. So that's, you don't know if that's the best one.
Of course. That's the whole heart in this. So I think our time is up. Thank you very much for your attention and for joining. Have a nice rest of your day.
Yeah, let us know if you have questions. Happy to follow up, and if you have use cases, happy to set it up and provide more information on how to do this. most of the documentations are up, and we will be adding more in the coming days as well. So please do check out the software page, and we are happy to answer and follow up.
Yeah, we encourage you all to try out, right? If you have questions, email us.
Yes, these are the command line version of the tutorials I was talking about. I don't know, I stopped showing. Yeah, feel free to explore the tutorials.